friends. Good evening.
Good evening.
How's everybody? You guys are so
Yeah, you might have
quiet.
to speak up a little bit now.
I'm gonna mic you.
It's hard.
Okay, we're gonna mic me just to be safe. So, Elaine's meeting tonight. It's great to see all of you. As Elaine said, this is the first of 3 Sunday nights where we're going to be talking about music in church. Tonight is sort of a very broad overview of the history of early church music, where they met, and then sort of an overview of what has happened evolutionarily in Western music specifically. Next week we'll get into Christian hymns and gospel songs, the writers that have influenced much of what we sing, where the great hymns of the church come from. We'll take that up through sort of modern, the rise of modern worship, what that looks like, Jesus music movement, and then where we are today. And then the third week, I want to take a look at some of the songs that we do here at Covenant. Would love for you guys to bring with you the title of one that stands out to you. Why do we do this one? Or I really like that one, or I really wish we'd never do that one again. And we can talk about those. We're also going to discuss sort of the theology of those songs, how they relate to the theology of this ragtag group out here, because we all come from a lot of diverse backgrounds. So coming up with a theology of worship for Covenant is it's a little hard to pin down, but it's been a lot of fun in the 9 years that I've been here to sort of hone and craft that and figure out what connects with us and what doesn't, frankly. So, but tonight we will be singing from the Celebration Hymnal. So I think everybody's got one. I don't play and sing these songs together very often, so I will probably stumble through. But just thought we'd do something a little different. We will begin with hymn 90, Joyful, Joyful, We Adore Thee. But before we do that, we're going to open with a word of prayer. God, it's good to be in your house. It's been a long day for some of us, and we welcome the opportunity to just take a breath here in a place that's holy. We thank you for your presence that's already here. Thank you for your Holy Spirit who comes when we meet. And we ask that you would take this time, enlighten us, give us some new perspective, God, on your early church and on music of the early church. As we continue to consider the role that worship plays in our lives, not just when we're here, but when we're in the car and when we're at home, and how worship is such a pervasive part of our lives. Be glorified tonight in all that we do. All your names are Joyful, joyful, we adore thee, God of glory, Lord of love. Hearts unfold like clouds before thee, still my soul.
Peace in my soul, the Lord is on my side. Every shall breathe the cross of free proclaim. Lead to thy God to order and provide. In every change, be faithful remain. Be still my soul, rest thy very friend. Before he raise these to a joyful end. Be still my soul, thy God doth undertake to guide the future as he guides the past. I hope thy confidence and love can share. All that is serious shall be bright at last. Be still my soul, waves the winds to roll. His voice will move the rocky world below. Be still my soul, the hours hasten on, and we shall meet forever with the Lord. When is the point when grief and fear are gone? Sorrow forgot, love's purest joys restored. Be still my soul, dreams and tears are past. All safe and blessed we shall be at last.
And the last one, 104.
Worship our King, all glorious above, and gratefully sing His wonderful love. Our shield and defender, ancient of days, crowned with splendor and girded with praise. Tell of His might and sing of His grace, whose robe is the light, His manna brings grace. His chariots of backward defined and wax cold, and darkness His path on the wings of a storm. Thy mountain declare, one tongue can recite, His reason proclaim, His shines in the light, His streams from the hills descends to the plains, and sweetly He stills in the dew and the rain. Praise to the one dwells and people of strength, in thee do we trust, nor find thee to fail. Thy mercies are tender, all from to the end. Our Maker, Defender, Redeemer, and Friend. All hail to our King, His banner enthroned. Thy praises we bring, Thy wonders made known. Returning victorious, great conqueror of sin. King Jesus, all glorious, our victory will win.
All right, so who can tell me what those three songs had in common? They weren't written by the same person. They were all written during the same period. Joyful, Joyful, We Adore Thee is a hymn tune. It's a text that was set to a tune by Beethoven. Be Still My Soul is a tune called Finlandia, which has been set, many texts have been set to it. That's the one that's most popular in the church, written by John Sibelius. And that last one, O Worship the King, is a Haydn tune that there's a text written to. So many songs of the church that we do are based in some of the musical types that we're going to talk about tonight and the different periods from which they come. So happy you guys are here. So I'm not a lecturer. I'm not a teacher by trade. And so I'm just going to talk. You have a handout so you can sort of follow along. There's some things that I'll ask you guys to kind of follow along with me. The fine points tonight, we're going to look at sort of the beginnings of the church, because you can't really understand the role that music played and plays in the church if you don't understand sort of where the church began. Moving from that into sort of the practices of the early church. Music as it began to become integrated with the church, which really was culminated then in the Mass. So we'll talk a little bit about the Mass and the parts of the Mass. And then I'm going to do just a really brief music history 101, the evolution of Western music, just to kind of walk us through then the historical periods that get us up to the 20th century. So that's sort of an overview. So before we look at the role that music eventually played in the early church, it is helpful to understand what it looked like when Christians gathered together in the early years of the church. Stay on the mic. Because I want to face you guys too. Okay. Christianity began as a small, persecuted Jewish sect. There was no break with the Jewish faith or traditions at that time. Early Christians still attended synagogue just as Jesus had. They were all Jews, either by birth or by conversion. So the early Christians still related very deeply to their Hebrew faith. And to become Christian meant becoming a Jew, too. It was kind of at that time, in the early church, they were still figuring it out. But Jewish tradition was very, very integral in the beginnings of Christian tradition. Many Christian traditions, most Christian traditions kind of grew out of what was happening in the Jewish faith. Then, as we know, from the mid-30s to 50s AD, the Apostle Paul traveled extensively throughout Asia Minor and Europe, using his status as both a devout Jew and a Roman citizen to minister to both the Jews and the non-Jews. There he was able to plant several churches, and his epistles, as well as the book of the Acts, document his work and his ministry. So that's when Christian churches began to have a distinct identity of their own, because there was an influx not only of non-Jews, but also cultural influences from Asia Minor and Europe. Feeding into that. Would somebody read for me? There's an Acts 2 passage there on your handout. Somebody be willing to read that for me?
The beginnings of the church.
There's a passage that's from Acts 2. It starts with They
devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching and to fellowship, to the breaking of bread and to prayer. Everyone was filled with awe at the many wonders and signs performed by the apostles. All the believers were together and had everything in common. They sold property and possessions to give to anyone who had need. Every day they continued to meet together in the temple courts. They broke bread in their homes and ate together with glad and sincere hearts, praising God and enjoying the flavor of all the people. And the Lord added to their number daily those who were being saved. Acts 2, what's that, verses 42 to 47?
Yes, thank you. Thank you. So what are some things you notice from this passage? This is a glimpse into early church meetings and what was going on in the early church at large.
They still met in the temple courts.
They gathered together.
They gathered, yeah. What did they do when they gathered?
They learned from each other and shared and took care of each other pretty much.
Very much of the early church.
That was the way they could get together and pass it to each other and kind of grow and find out.
Very social.
Very social.
Yeah. So a lot of gossip is going on too, right?
What else? What else do you see here?
They broke bread in their
Yeah.
homes, so they all went to their homes. They went home to individual homes after meeting in the temple courts.
Okay. What else you guys notice?
And this was all in God enjoyed seeing all this happening, this togetherness and all this sort of stuff. It was pleasing to him.
Yes.
They were sacrificed for the good of the all because they sold their possessions.
Yes.
Yeah.
There's clear leadership. It's not let's all gather and everybody says anything. It's they're devoting themselves to the apostles' teaching.
Right. Right.
And that this was done regularly. It said
Yes.
the number added to the number daily.
Daily.
So
Right. Anything else?
The spirit was inclusion. It was not exclusion.
Yes. Very much so, because even for the non-Jews in the earliest, I mean, they were converting people into Judaism to be a part of their fellowship, to be a part of their family. There was no exclusions.
Well, it does sound the description sounds more like siblings than like different people who happen to come together.
Right.
You know.
Right. Yeah, there was a definitely familial spirit.
Well, I kind of found that the part about like the everything in common kind of interesting. Like that could mean a lot of different things. But they were clearly gathering as one mind or sort of one set of beliefs or one goal. One could be anything. You know.
Yeah.
There was a definite focus.
Yes. So these early churches, they met in homes, not just once a week, but throughout the week. House churches allowed believers to challenge the social order of the day. Christians became witnesses of the gospel through one another's lives, words, and suffering. The atmosphere was familial. Brotherly love was lived out in personal and effective ways. Christians broke bread together every time they met. Sharing the Lord's Supper or Eucharist was a very common practice, as this was seen as central and distinctive to their faith and different from their Jewish practices. So structure beyond that in these early churches were flexible. So different churches might operate a little differently, but there was clear leadership. These elements were generally, scholars agree that these elements were almost always present, however. There was always worship of some sort. Now, that at this point might or might not be singing, because we don't have a lot of evidence of what was going on in terms of music at this point, as we'll get to in a minute. Practice of spiritual gifts, teaching, of course, prayer, fellowship, as we talked about, evangelism. So that implies some activity, reaching out, right? It wasn't just whoever showed up, but they were reaching out into their community. Eucharist and baptism was also a part of what they did. So there's a rather lengthy excerpt that I'm going to have us read that I found really fascinating. There was a Christian philosopher and apologist named Justin Martyr in the 2nd century, and he wrote a work called First Apology. And in it, it's sort of, part of it is an account of Christian worship and beliefs. It was originally addressed to the Roman Emperor in defense of these Christian churches that were meeting. Somebody want to read the first paragraph of this from your handout? It starts how we dedicated ourselves.
How we dedicated ourselves to God when we were made new through Christ, I will explain, since it might seem to be unfair if I left this out from my exposition. Those who are persuaded and believe that the things we teach and say are true and promise that they can live accordingly are instructed to pray and beseech God with the fasting for the remission of their past sins, while we pray and fast along with them. Then they are brought by us where there is water, and are reborn by the same manner of rebirth by which we ourselves were reborn. For they are then washed in the water in the name of the God the Father and the Master of all, and of our Savior Jesus Christ, and of the Holy Spirit. For Christ said, unless you are born again, you will not enter into the kingdom of heaven. After thus washing, the one who was
That's good.
That's okay. Go ahead. You can go ahead and read
I was
that.
waiting. I paused.
Oh, go ahead.
After thus washing the one who has been conceived is signified as assent, we lead that him to those who are called brethren, whether they are assembled. They then earnestly offer common prayers for themselves and the one who has been illuminated, and all others everywhere, that we may be made worthy, having learned the truth, to be found indeed good citizens and keepers of what is commanded, so that we may be saved with the eternal salvation. Somebody take over the next one.
Okay. we can pause there for a second. So what do you guys see in this passage? What are they talking about?
What do they talk about this?
Sounds to me they're talking about salvation and baptism.
Yeah.
Virgin experience.
Mm-hmm.
Sort of just really explaining it step by step.
Breaking it down, because this is again addressed to the Roman emperor, so he's trying to really make plain what's going on. What else do you notice there?
It's not just like a bullet point thing. There's words like believe, and it's speaking to the spiritual side. It's not just okay, we meet, we do this, and we do this, and then we're baptized. It's fleshed out a little bit more to say this is a real experience.
There's instruction and mentoring before they are ever baptized.
Right.
Right. They believe that the things we teach and say are true, and promise that they can live accordingly. Then they pray and fast while we pray and fast along with them. Right. And then they're brought to water. Right. And then only after that do they come into the assembly.
Yeah.
I mean, it's really this process long before they ever walk into what we would call the church.
Right. Who wants to read the next paragraph?
I can give it a shot. I left my readers in the car, but we'll see. So far, so good. On finishing the prayers, we greet each other with a kiss. The bread and cup of water are mixed. Bread and a cup of water are mixed. Wine are brought to the president of the brethren, and he, taking them, sends up praise and glory to the Father of the universe through the name of the Son and of the Holy Spirit, and offers thanksgiving at some length that we have been deemed worthy to receive these things from him. When he has finished the prayers and the thanksgiving, the whole congregation presents assent, saying, Amen, Amen, in the Hebrew language means, so be it. When the president has given thanks and the whole congregation has assented, those whom we call deacons give to each of those present a portion of the consecrated bread and wine and water, and they take it to the absent.
Let me read the next one.
This food we call Eucharist, of which no one is allowed to partake except one who believes that the things we teach are true, and has received the washing for forgiveness of sins and for rebirth, and who lives as Christ handed down to us. For we do not receive these things as common bread or common drink, but as Jesus Christ our Savior, being incarnate by God's word, took flesh and blood for our salvation. So also we have been taught that the food consecrated by the word of prayer, which comes from him, from which our flesh and blood are nourished by transformation, is the flesh and blood of that incarnate Jesus. For the apostles and the memoirs composed by them, which are called Gospels, thus handed down what was commanded them, that Jesus, taking bread and had given thanks, said, Do this for my memorial. This is my body. And likewise, taking the cup and giving thanks, he said, This is my blood, and gave it to them alone.
So pretty clear instruction there about Eucharist, what Eucharist is.
So that's why the Catholics know that It says this is a closed communion.
At this point, the way that they practiced communion was like they practiced baptism.
Right.
There was a mentorship that you went through. There were things that you learned and things that you knew before you approached the Eucharist. Anything else anybody notices?
I'd say the length. That was a lot. I think that speaks to the importance. When he
Importance
devoted
of
that to large paragraphs to that.
I love that they gave to those whom we call deacons a portion of the consecrated bread and wine and water to take to the absent. So if you're sick or tending to an ailing loved one or something, then they would take the elements to you.
And what is crucial is about the reason why you do take, because otherwise it's just basic common bread and common drink in any other given situation. But specifically for this situation, it's just like you're like the member of the club, so to speak. And
It's a very elevated process.
It also has that language of, that this is an incarnation. That the Eucharist becomes an incarnation.
Right.
The
Right.
Eucharist becomes transformed. It's not a
The flesh and blood
memorial.
of Jesus.
It's the real stuff.
Yeah.
And so you don't want people taking it who aren't understanding what that is, and then it becomes incredibly important that you take it to somebody else. Right.
Right. Another thing too that I noticed, or that I took from reading this entire passage, is that this is a group of people trying to establish their own identity. So there are things that they're doing that they feel that they have experienced as holy, that they recognize as holy, and you have to understand this is before the creeds. This is before there's a set of standard beliefs that sort of transcend the church, capital C. So at this point, they're figuring it out. And these are things they know to be true. So these are things that they hold out as special and honored and revered. And this is how we're going to do this. And it is something that marks us, our people, right? So that's part of why there was such a process that you had to go through to become part of their family to do these things. Even in that next little short paragraph, after these services, we constantly remind each other of these things. Those who have more come to the aid of those who lack, and we're constantly together. Over all that we receive, we bless the Maker of all things through His Son, Jesus Christ, and the Holy Spirit. So this is a very pervasive, this is a lifestyle. This is a lifestyle for them. All right, and who wants to read the last part of this?
And on the day called Sunday, there is a meeting in one place of those who live in the cities or the country, and the memoirs of the apostles or the writings of the prophets are read as long as time permits. When the reader has finished, the president in that discourse urges and invites us to the imitation of these noble things. Then we all stand up together and offer prayers. And as said before, when we have finished the prayer, bread is brought, and wine and water, and the president similarly sends up prayers and thanksgivings to the best of his ability, and the congregation assents, saying the Amen. The distribution and reception of the consecrated elements by each one takes place, and they are sent to the absent by the deacons. They are sent by the Those who prosper and who so wish contribute, each one as much as he chooses to. What is collected is deposited with the president, and he takes care of orphans and widows, and those who are in want or account of sickness or any other cause, and those who are in bonds, and the strangers who are sojourners among us. And briefly, he is the protector of all those in need. We all hold this common gathering on Sunday, since it is the first day on which God, transforming darkness and matter, made the universe, and Jesus Christ, our Savior, rose from the dead on the same day. For they crucified him on the day before Saturday, and on the day after Saturday, he appeared to his apostles and disciples and taught them these things which I have passed on to you also for your serious consideration.
I chuckled a little at a couple of things in this one.
Yeah.
It was that they would read the memoirs and writings of the apostles as long as time permits. It's like, okay, it's a little open-ended. The offering of prayers, we hear here for the first time, it's talking about prayers. And prayers, and Greg's alluded to this, Elaine has as well, prayers in this time were corporate prayers. So prayer was a very corporate, it was seen as prayers from the people, prayers of the people, prayers for the people. So prayer was not, the way we understand prayer culturally is that it's a very private and individual thing. But in this day and age, and still in Jewish faith, it's a very public thing. And it's a very corporate, all of us thing. So prayer was a big part of what they did, but it was prayer in sort of a different way. And then they talk about the Sunday gatherings. Even though they gather throughout the week, the Sunday gathering is special. There's something set apart about that. Because that's when they recognize that Jesus was raised from the dead. And so they want to remember that by... And you have to notice, too, that the first day of the week is not the Sabbath. The seventh day of the week is the Sabbath. So a lot of times, these folks would be working all day on Sunday, and then they would gather in the evening. They would bring bread, and then there would be teaching and prayer and all the other parts of the service. So it wasn't the Sabbath. It wasn't the Jewish Sabbath. So what similarities and differences do you notice between this church and the way we worship corporately today?
There's more meetings.
More meetings.
Y'all still do the house during the week, different houses?
We do some things in homes. We're getting ready to do some cottage prayer meetings. We have some circle groups that meet in homes.
Right.
Elaine and I have things that we do on Wednesday evenings. So, we have some things that happen outside of this building.
Obviously, we still come together on Sunday.
And we come together on Sunday.
We tithe.
And yes, we tithe. We talk about tithing. However, did you notice they didn't specify how much or what to give? It said those who have will contribute, and those who wish, and they will take that money and they'll distribute it to orphans and widows, those who are in want or on account of sickness or other cause, those who are in bonds, strangers among us.
What makes you wonder who came up with the 10%?
Well, that is an Old Testament principle.
Oh, it is.
Mm-hmm. But I just find it interesting that here they're not as specific about what you give, but they are fairly specific about what they're going to do with it.
Right.
Anything else you guys notice?
Yes, the teaching and preaching of the word is not as forefront as it is today, especially in Protestant churches. Especially in 155 AD, when did they start bringing the books together? When did they, what were they teaching? Just off
Well, they were reading from the Hebrew scriptures.
So it was, okay.
And it talks about the apostles' memoirs.
Okay.
So that's the beginnings of the Gospels and the epistles. Yeah. No, not
They
the epistles, but
earlier
the Gospels.
called them Gospels.
Yeah. So they're remembering Jesus, the life of Jesus, the teachings of Jesus, but then they're also reading the ancient scriptures.
Different communities had somewhat different collections of various letters and such, and so when they're codified, it's the churches come together and say, okay, well, I'm really grossly exaggerating, right?
Well,
40 churches use that, one church uses that, that's clearly more important than that. You know what I mean?
And the other thing too, I'm saying reading, they're not reading anything. This is all spoken.
Right.
So this is generationally passed and spoken, because the printing press didn't come until much later. Mm-hmm. So that's part of why I think they're talking about how we do this every time we meet. It's like, this is to keep this alive.
Well, the basic structure seems familiar. Like it's not so far off.
No, it's really not.
I mean, the details are very different, obviously, but the basic structure.
They didn't have a priest or anything back then. It was a president.
Someone that was presiding over the meeting, yeah.
Yeah, but he was called president, not the pastor or anything.
Yeah, he referred to him as the president, which kind of made me laugh too. But he's the presider over the meeting.
Maintains order, probably.
Maintains order, keeps things moving the way they're supposed to be going. What's missing?
There's no mention of music.
There's no mention of music. No mention of music. The only account we have of singing in the Gospels is in Matthew 26. The disciples and Jesus were in the upper room and they had just finished the Lord's Supper. Matthew 26:30 says, when they had sung a hymn, they went out to the Mount of Olives. That's all we got. Now, Paul talks about singing in a couple of different passages in the letters. He encourages the Ephesians in Ephesians 5:19 by saying, "Be filled with the Spirit, speaking to one another with psalms, hymns, and songs from the Spirit. Sing and make music from your hearts to the Lord." And then again in the Colossian letter, verse 3:16, he says, "Let the message of Christ dwell among you richly as you teach and admonish one another with all wisdom through psalms, hymns, and songs from the Spirit, singing to God with gratitude in your hearts." So, of course, we know that singing was and is an integral part of Jewish worship. We know that the Psalms were sung. Music is celebrated in the Psalms, and the singing that took place in those early Christian gatherings were songs that they knew from those Jewish festivals and celebrations.
What about just adding the Old Testament, where like Jericho and so there were battles where they were preceded the
Right, where there was trumpet blasts and
celebration,
people
but
raising loud voices
for other reasons.
For other reasons, but then again, I mean, the Jews were singing. There was music, but in the Christian church, we don't see much of that until later. So yeah, I mean, music was used in all kinds of contexts in the Old Testament, even in battle. There's a cultural reference to singing in the church in the writings of Pliny the Younger. This really cracked me up. He was a Roman governor of Bithynia. He wrote a letter to the Roman Emperor Trajan? I don't know how you say that. Around 112 AD, asking for advice on how to prosecute Christians. Now, we're not sure what he wanted to prosecute the Christians for, but there is one thing that he was really irritated by, and that was the fact that the Christians were gathering before sunrise and singing. And they were singing antiphonally, which is very interesting. So the way that he puts it in his letter to the emperor, he says that they are singing antiphonally a hymn to Christ as to God. Okay, so there's some of the irritation right there. Christ as to God. So antiphonal psalmody is the singing or playing of psalms by alternating groups of performers, not unlike the way that the Israelites worshiped. So it is believed that this practice of antiphonal singing was introduced into Christian worship by Ignatius, who saw alternating choirs of angels singing in a vision that he had. And essentially, antiphonal singing is call and response. So it could be a soloist to a choir, or it could be a choir to a congregation, but where there's a phrase sung and then it's repeated back. So they're meeting before dawn and making a lot of noise, singing antiphonally, and Pliny doesn't like this very much.
Is there any mention of coffee in this?
So
I
he's that neighbor, right?
He is so that neighbor. There are accounts from ancient witnesses such as Pope Clement I, Tertullian, Saint Athanasius in Nigeria, who confirm the practice of corporate singing and worship. There is musical notation. It's very simple and basic, in existence for the 3rd century hymn, the Oxyrhynchus hymn. It's Greek, and that's the earliest musical notation that we have for anything in the 3rd century. Other musical elements began to appear in the 3rd century church. Hippolytus, who was a theologian, in his work, The Apostolic Tradition, attests to the singing of Hallel psalms, which are Jewish prayers offered as songs in celebrations, with Alleluia as a refrain. So they would kind of take the psalm and then they would make it their own by adding the Alleluia refrain. And they were sung at the early Christian agape feasts, which also were sort of modeled after some of the Jewish festivals. Then in the 4th century, desert monks following St. Anthony introduced the practice of continuous psalmody, singing the complete cycle of 150 psalms every week.
Wow.
How long did that take?
Every week.
Every week.
Every week.
Bottles of beer on the wall.
If you go and visit the Abbey of Gethsemane in Kentucky, their order does that as well. So if you were there for 7 days and hit all 7 of the services each day, you would get through this. You would get through the Psalms.
I mean, is that like 8 hours a day, 4 hours a
No,
day?
it's 7 times a day you meet for worship, and each one is about between 15 minutes to half an hour.
So they do have coffee breaks.
We have work breaks.
Around that same time, early Christian hymns known as canticles began to show up, and these were songs that were based on biblical passages other than the Psalms. And some of these are still used in Catholic, Lutheran, Anglican, and Methodist liturgy. Around 375, antiphonal psalmody became popular in the Christian Eastern Orthodox Church, and in 386, St. Ambrose introduced the practice to the Western Church. So then in the 5th century, a singing school, the first one, the Schola Cantorum, was founded in Rome to provide training in church musicianship. Also during this time, 6th and 7th centuries, early Celtic hymns started to show up, associated with St. Patrick and St. Columba. So you can see that music as a form is in its infancy, but it's starting in the church. It's very much a part of the church, and there's this give and take relationship that happens throughout history between the music at large, music of the culture, and music of the church. It's very interesting. So then we get to plain song. Plain song consists of a single unaccompanied melodic line with a free unmetered rhythm, and it was introduced in the 6th century. The most popular, or probably the most well-known form of plain song is Gregorian chant, named for Pope Gregory, even though he really had nothing to do with it.
But he was Pope.
He was Pope, that's right. It was the most widely known type, still is, most widely known type of plain song used in the church, though there are other types of chant. And these chants included prayers, hymns, canticles, and psalms, by and large. And in just a bit, I'll play you an example of what Gregorian chant sounds like. 2 methods of singing chants are responsorial and antiphonal. In responsorial singing, the soloist sings a series of verses, each one followed by a response. In antiphonal singing, it's alternated lines, so call and response. And again, it can be soloist to choir, or it can be choir to congregation. Much later, in the 9th century, plain song began evolving into organum, which led to the development of polyphony. So this form of singing eventually morphs into what we understand as harmony. In fact, I'll give you a little sense of what organum is. So, in general, a plain chant melody, organum, is a plain chant melody with at least one added voice to enhance the harmony. Depending on the mode and the form of the chant, the supporting bass line could be there sung on the same text as well. So sometimes it's 2 parts, sometimes it's 3 parts. But it's parallels. So what it would do is it would start on a note, and then it would divide out. So you've got one here, and then from here they're just going to parallel. Like that. And then at the end of it, it's going to go back to one note. So that was the earliest form of organum. And it was a Gregorian chant melody, and the interval part, interestingly, would be improvised. So you would have a musician that knew the melody to the chant, and then you would have someone else doing the alternate part. And it was somebody that could do that without knowing what it was. I mean, they were just making it up on the spot. But I mean, obviously, when it's parallels, it's, you know, it's not that hard to do that. But at that time, it was a pretty novel thing. It was a new thing. But from that, eventually, then composers would start to write that part and what that part should be, and then that's where you started to get away from the fourthy thing to, you know, kind of more the intervals that we're used to hearing, thirds and fifths and other things. Does that make sense? Interesting. Okay, so from that comes the Mass. In the 7th century, under Pope Vitalian, which I have to say is the coolest Pope name ever. If I was going to be Pope, I wouldn't want to be Vitalian. It sounds like a super.
Keep that in mind.
Pope Vitalian, the Mass came to be, which is a choral composition that sets parts of the Eucharistic liturgy to music. For a composition to be a full Mass, it must have 5 invariable sections that make up what is called the ordinary. These 5 parts: the Kyrie, the Gloria, Credo, Sanctus Benedictus, and Agnus Dei. So, Kyrie is Lord have mercy, as you might be familiar. We've done some variations on what a Kyrie is here during Lent. I'm just going to pull up an example of what one of those early Kyries might have sounded like. This is from Bach. This is his Mass in B minor. So this would have been a little bit later. This was after sort of the Mass had become a fixture in the church. People knew what it was, and then the composers started to really become a little more creative. The B minor Mass.
B minor.
Mhm. Yeah. So, so this is the Kyrie, Bach's Mass in B minor. Then,
Put the mic next to your speaker.
The mic on the speaker.
there it is.
No, I don't know either.
That didn't help.
That didn't help.
So you can see that by this time there's instrumental music here as well, so it's not just vocal.
There it goes.
So that goes on for a while. This is, by a while I mean 12 minutes. This is the Gloria from the same Mass.
Can you just perk up a little bit?
So the Gloria is essentially glory be to God on high. Next part would be the Credo. I don't have an example of that one, but that is a setting of the Creed, the Nicene Creed. I believe in one God. Then this is a Sanctus, which is holy, holy, holy. You get the idea. So the Mass has to have, for it to be a full Mass, those 5 parts: the Kyrie, the Gloria, the Credo, the Sanctus, Benedictus, and the Agnus Dei. Now, there are different Masses for different occasions. So there are special Masses, and like Requiems, for instance, is a special kind of Mass. And the parts that are added to that are called the proper of the Mass, and that just means these are elements that are specific to that particular Mass, which are specific to that particular occasion. So. The Kyrie was the first part of the Mass to ever be sung, and it was in the 7th century, and it was done in chant. And then the Credo was the last part added, and that was in 1014. So it took 300 years, sort of, for the evolution of just the ordinary of the Mass. Have any of you experienced the Mass before? In a part of the Mass, yeah?
Same 20 times.
Yeah.
I used to sing it 100 times.
Masses are not exclusively in Latin. There have been many Masses, very popular ones, written in English. Andrew Lloyd Webber wrote a Requiem. That's pretty amazing. Bernstein has a Mass. That's pretty great.
Now, were these written after 1964?
Yes.
Okay, because that's after they switched from Latin to English.
Yes. And I mean, of course, the Latin Mass is still used and revered,
Yeah.
but there have been masses written in other languages,
Uh-huh.
and English being among them. But it's kind of moving, and again, I think that the Mass is another illustration of the church reasserting, this is what we believe, this is who we are, this is who God is, these statements, and they're consistent, and even if the music changes, the statement is the same, and these parts are always there and a part of it, and that's sort of the beauty of that type of liturgy, Mass. Questions about anything I've said so far? Or comments? So essentially we're up to, we're going to step back for a minute. I want to look a little more at, or just give you a little more background on each of the historical periods that we're talking about. But essentially that takes us up to 10th century. So it's 1,000 years from the beginning. So Western music, I thought it might be helpful to sort of do just a really quick rundown of sort of the historical periods of Western music, because this is the type of music that we relate to and understand, particularly as it relates to the Western Church. You can break it down into a lot of different periods. These are sort of the broad ones. So you have the medieval period, which happened from 500 to 1400, roughly. You have to understand that these periods are not just music, they're also art and philosophy and thought. So there are things going on culturally in the church and in art and in music, and all of these things correlate very closely.
Is that also called the Dark Ages?
I think that usually, yeah, I think that gets referred to as the Dark Ages. During the medieval period, this 500 to 1400, starts out as chant, solely vocal and choral, and polyphony begins. Then we start to see instrumental music, and the instruments of the day, there were wind instruments like flutes and recorders. There were also stringed instruments like lutes and dulcimers. And then the organ was the primary instrument of the church as we got later in that period, closer to the 900s. Then the Renaissance period, which, as we know, the Renaissance was clearly very much a change in thought all across Europe. 1400 to 1600, it's when polyphony became very commonplace. Music was based on modes, which are, and you probably noticed this in some of the Bach Mass, a lot of repetitive phrases. So short phrases that get repeated in different places. Maybe the bass line does it, and then the sopranos sing it, and then it shows up in the alto line, and then you move it here, and then you do it over here. And so modes are like short musical phrases, and they became sort of the building blocks for these pieces during the Renaissance period. Staff notation, the way we understand it now, came into being during the Renaissance period, which made, then when the printing press happened in the same general period of time, then music got spread really quickly. And there was, schools were coming up on how to teach people how to write and read music. So at that point, it was becoming a huge part of everything, not just church. People were, going to the concert hall, and they were hearing performances. And I was going to play you an example of something during this period. Now, concern for musicality started to become a thing during the Renaissance period. Up until then, there wasn't a lot of thought or consideration given to things like dynamics, louder and softer, or broader and smaller. So flow begins to become a thing, and chordal progressions become a thing, because if you remember, when you're starting out here, there's not really any chordal, that's just very, very simple, basic parallel harmonies. But then composers start to become aware of and concerned with chords. But even in the Renaissance period, key wasn't a thing. Key becomes something in the Baroque period, where composers begin to write within certain boundaries, because up until that time, flats and sharps didn't exist. So there was no such thing as playing in a given key. So I was going to play for you a little bit of Jos Can Dupree. This is his Ave Maria. Let's play a little bit. So what are some things you notice about that?
It's a lot different than Schubert.
You hear those little phrases I was talking about? The way they play with each other, how they repeat. The bass will sing it, and the soprano will sing it. And even in this case, it was the same words, the same text moving around. Also, a lot of thought given to phrasing. It's like big sweeping phrasing. Dynamics, where it would swell and then get big and then get. So dynamics, musicality, all these things are coming into play during the Renaissance period. Following the Renaissance, you got the Baroque period from 1600 to 1750. Many great composers rose up during that period. Bach, Handel, Vivaldi, and Monteverdi among them. The creation of tonality, which is an approach to writing music in which a key is given to a particular song or piece. During the Baroque era, professional musicians were expected to be accomplished improvisers with both solo melodic lines and accompaniment parts, leading to the development of counterpoint, where you have the left hand and the right hand and they're answering one another. And then Baroque period music expanded the size, range, and complexity of instrumental performance. Also established the mixed vocal and instrumental forms of opera, cantata, and oratorio. Also the instrumental forms of the solo concerto and the sonata. So these are all types of music that are coming into being because of what's going on during the Baroque period. I was going to play you a little bit of a piece you guys will recognize.
Benny,
Yes.
apologize, but we're going to have to book out.
Okay.
We're going to get to the gospel show and hear
Okay.
music.
Okay. Well, you
I
guys
do
have a nice
apologize.
night. No problem. Have a good night.
Alright.
Thanks for being here. We really appreciate you
thank
stopping
you.
in. So this is one that you'll recognize, I'm sure.
Brandenburg. Excuse me. Don't fight, guys.
So you notice the players are very accomplished. and there's key. So even when they stray, like they did in that little part there, they come right back. There's a groundedness about it. That's water music.
Everybody's singing.
I did a paper in high school in my senior English class that compared and contrasted water music with the Messiah. I know. I'm such a nerd.
Doesn't get much nerdier.
Two handle pieces. I know. My English teacher was.
Benton, could you explain the key thing a little bit?
Yeah.
Like, I'm trying to imagine. So, when you play a song, I'm thinking about simple songs like stuff we sing. When you play a song in a particular key, I don't understand how it would sound different if you didn't have the key in there. Like, what would be different?
Well, it's very hard for me to think about what it would be like to have no key. What we can do is we can do a song major and minor. Okay, so these are variations on. Okay, so say let's do it. Let's do here. For instance, how great is our God? Sing with me, how great is our God? All will sing how great is our God. Very bright and majory. Okay. How great is our God? Our God. Sing with me, how great is our God? All will sing how great is our God. But even that's key.
Right.
It's just minor versus major. So I guess to have no key would just mean that you do. They were
Whatever you want.
yeah, well, and it would depend on the instrument because instruments nothing was tuned together, and so different instruments had different possibilities. So you might have a flute that could play from say here to here, chromatically, all those notes. So then at that point you could be like playing, I don't know, they could be. That's no key, that's atonal. So and nothing we do these days is that way. None of that's atonal. Nothing's atonal.
It's totally
anymore.
foreign.
So when they had the organ earlier, did they not have? They wouldn't have had the black keys. They wouldn't have had sharps.
They
were whole note instruments.
They did well. The first. I don't know the history on the organ and the harpsichord. The piano came later.
Yeah.
But I mean, there were black notes. I don't know when that happened, because again, there had to have been some sense of standard tonality to establish what is a half note.
Mm-hmm.
So, if those standards weren't already, those standards had to be recognized, created, set, and then established on different instruments, so that everybody was getting to the same place. So in the earliest forms of music, of course, were vocal. Then the instrumentation that was added was simple. It was lutes, dulcimers, flutes, and recorders. Mm-hmm. So harpsichord and organ would have been the most sophisticated instrument, and I would assume with the Mass coming on in 7th century and it began as chant, it was probably another 200 years before you saw an organ. Mm-hmm.
Well, just technologically,
Yeah.
it would require
Right.
something, right?
Right. Yeah. So yeah, the idea of key gave order. Key gave order, and it opened up the possibility for instruments to play together. I think before that it was very difficult for lutes and flutes and dulcimers and to play together.
So it might not matter as much in composition, but in being able to figure out how instruments can play what you want all at the same time, but not play exactly the same thing.
Yeah. So giving those kinds of boundaries actually opened up a lot of possibilities.
Okay.
Yeah,
Okay.
for sure.
It was the introduction of the harmony concept kind of running congruent with that?
Polyphony was happening, yeah, about the same time that that instruments were being added.
Which totally would make sense.
Yeah, which would make sense. So,
Yeah.
so the polyphony was not, again, it was very basic, simple, two-part, and it wasn't something that everybody could hear or understand. So you basically had to be, you had your soloist that was anchored to the melody, and sometimes there was a bass line as well, that either might move with or independent of the melody, depending. But that extra person was adding that thing. And it's just like, you think about it though, and I mean, it's like every era of music, there's always been a Chuck Berry. There's always been somebody that's going to introduce something new that people are going to go, what did he just do? And then you listen to it a few times, and you're like, that's pretty cool. I don't know how he does that, but I kind of like that. And then people start to adapt. And it's happened that way throughout music from the earliest. You have some renegade that makes up something, and then somebody else does it, and then it shows up everywhere. So Baroque music, we're all really familiar kind of with where music comes from there, and then going forward. The classical period was lighter and less complex. So the classical composers saw Baroque music as tedious and bothersome and too much angst, too much going on. So at that point, melody became really, really important. So that's where you started to see more sweeping melodies and more like a melody with accompaniment, whether the melody was being sung or whether it was a solo concerto on a violin or whether it was something else. Counterpoint wasn't gone, but everything got a lot simpler. Harpsichord was replaced by the piano as the primary instrument during this period. And instrumental music really becomes a big thing. That's when you start to see symphonies and larger sonatas and bigger performances, and then the great halls are being built in Europe to accommodate this. So now you have music apart from the church, but also what you need to understand is that the same composers that were writing for the culture were also writing for the church. In fact, a lot of them were being commissioned to write for the church. Some of them were actually on staff, if you could say that, or they were part of the king's court, where they were part of writing what happened at the royal parties, and they were the part of what were happening in the churches, and it was all kind of an interesting mishmash of things. And it's just like, people talk about revere these great songs, and the songs are amazing, but some of the people, they were scalawags. I mean, they really were. So it wasn't that they were writing, some of these people were not writing out of, their heart of love for God. They were writing, for a paycheck. And because they loved to write, and they were creatives.
Well, it had become an art form at that point. It wasn't just...
Right. It was taking on a life of its own.
Yeah.
Composers during that time were Mozart, Beethoven, and Schubert. They were the three big ones. And also, too, I need to say that even though, the time period there is given is 1730 to 1820, which is only not even 100 years. I mean, you definitely could argue different dates. And again, some of these dates correspond, too, with what's going on in other art forms, too, and also in philosophy and other things. So there are changes that are happening culturally and within the church that are congruent, and those are the dates that we typically recognize for those kinds of things. Then following that classical period is the Romantic period, which is actually a lot of what we enjoy in like film scores today takes a lot of what they do from the Romantic period. Now, I've got a list on there for you about the Romantic period and what was going on in the zeitgeist during that time. Music became more expressive and emotional, expanding to encompass literary, artistic, and philosophical themes. Characteristics of the music and thought in general of this period are very, very many, but here are some of the big ones. A new preoccupation with and surrender to nature. When I think about that, I think about Debussy, Prelude to the Afternoon of a A fascination with the past, particularly the Middle Ages and legends of medieval chivalry. Fondness for that. A turn toward the mystic and supernatural, both religious and merely spooky. A longing for the infinite. Mysterious connotations of remoteness, the unusual and fabulous, the strange and surprising. New attention given to national identity. And discontent with musical formulas and conventions. There's a lot going on right there.
But just that they were discontent with musical formulas and conventions that hadn't been around longer than 200 years.
Yes.
I mean,
Uh-huh.
just how much faster things are moving at that point.
Yeah, and I mean, this whole thing happened in a period of 100 years, and essentially you can break the Romantic period easily into two halves.
Right.
You have Schumann, Chopin, Mendelssohn on the front end of that, and then you have like Tchaikovsky later. So it's just an interesting, very fast evolution of creative expression in all forms. I mean, and you can look at the Romantic period of art, and it's the same. You just have a lot of interesting contrasts going on.
But this is all high musicality, right? What we would consider really formal, right? And at the same time, you've got shaker hymns, and you've got, banjo being invented, and stuff that is just seems
You've got
like
regional,
radically
right?
different.
You've got regional things happening that eventually spread and influence the culture at large,
Yeah.
like you do now. I mean, like you have in the 20th century with Harlem, with New Orleans and Memphis, all the way, to things that are going on right now.
Right.
It's interesting. But during that period, during the Romantic period, I was going to play you. Everything becomes very. There's an etherealness about everything, and like there's a high-mindedness. But then at the same time, they're so aware that they don't want to come off as high-minded. It's just really interesting. It's my favorite period of music to study because it's just fascinating what's going on in people's minds during this time. It's just
They feel much lighter to me than, like, when I think of Brahms and Tchaikovsky, they're just much lighter than Mozart and Beethoven. It's almost like you can play those in the background, whereas Mozart and Beethoven are very intrusive.
yeah, Beethoven especially is very in your face. Let's see, which Brahms? Let's do. This is Hungarian Dance number 1 in G minor. 1869. He wrote 21 of those. And then this is Tchaikovsky.
I've talked before about the distinction between what I think of as the historical liturgical church and revival church, right?
Yes.
And that they're radically different in the way they see the job
Yes.
of the church. Seems to me the music would have been radically different as well. This is high church,
Yes.
right? It's not what a collection of Baptists were singing in the Delta,
Right.
right?
Right.
And I'm thinking as you're moving forward in this, since I'm not going to be here next week, just that when we in here, we're not doing this.
No. And this
But-
isn't really. I've
No, but I-
sort
no,
of
no,
veered
no, no.
off from the church a little bit to
No,
just
no,
talk
no.
about what's going on in Western music.
Right,
Yeah.
no, but I just mean there's like later there becomes this real divergence
Yes.
that
Yes.
affects us in a way that it wouldn't affect the Catholic Church down the road.
Right,
It's
right,
kind of
right.
a different texture to
One
it.
of the things that I'm going to touch on next week. Basically, with Christianity, we kind of start in 16th century Europe with the Luthers, and then there's a couple of different philosophies on worship that happen that we'll talk about. But the Reformation approach is the approach that we all sort of embraced in the Protestant Church, and out of that came Isaac Watts, Charles Wesley, Fanny Crosby, and then there was the Methodist revival of the 18th century. There was an explosion of hymn writing in Welsh that continued into the 19th century. Then you have the African American tradition of spirituals that came out of slavery during the Second Great Awakening in the United States. This led to a whole different popular style. So you have a lot of regional things that are happening. You have the rise of folk music, and folk music is different in different parts of the country. You have purely American things that are happening. So it's all intertwined with the rise of certain types of churches.
Right.
And when I say types of churches, I don't mean just theology. I mean like types of gatherings, where they gathered, what they did, when they got together, and those kinds of things, because music was a part of all of that, and the type of music was influenced by all of that. It's like everything's feeding everything, which is still happening. But I think then it was just really sharp. You could really tell.
Even in my lifetime, I mean, I feel like we've gone through huge shifts in what is acceptable. And like I remember in the I guess it'd be the early 70s, the first discussions of do we have that kind of music in our church, which at the time was tinted with rock. You had Jesus Christ Superstar happening, you had Godspell happening, and you had Christianity having a little bit of rock, a little bit of country, a little bit of and there was a serious discussion about it. And when I was growing up, it was not really welcomed.
It's still not in some churches.
And we ended up doing a musical that was, as modern as you could get at the time. That was the story of Jesus, and I can't. It was called Celebrate Life. I don't know if you.
I remember Celebrate Life.
Yeah. And that was radical.
It was,
It
yeah.
really
It
wasn't,
was.
but it was radical for them.
It was.
Because it was pop. It was basically pop music.
Yeah, it was Lloyd Webber, very light.
Yeah.
Very, very light.
Like Weber light, yes.
Very, very light, yeah.
But to be where we are today with Hillsong, and that kind of music is, that's a big shift in not that long of a period of time. It seems like things are changing faster as time, as maybe it's technology and everything else too, but from what you first talked about very early, how much time it took to get from one change to another, and then you've got 100 years and there's tons of things happening. Yeah, interesting. It's really fascinating.
And especially in the church, I guess there's so much liberty, especially now, especially us Western Christians, because even it took a while for me to get used to Hillsong and certain things like that. And then hearing like Vineyard and stuff like that was like a whole nother zone. So it's like even today, I can see how that changes rapidly.
And something else that we'll probably talk about in the third session is about how we attach to these songs. and how they become a part of the fabric of our church experience. Those things are not connected to God as much as they are our own personal histories and our own personal stories and our own personal experiences. So that's why a lot of times, people will say, let's sing the good old songs of the church. What they mean is they want to hear some of the songs that they grew up with, because there's a fondness and a nostalgia, and it connects with them in a different place, and it means something. So it is interesting how we connect to what we connect with in church, and frankly, for a lot of our folks, they didn't grow up in church, so that's not so much a thing. But if you go to First Baptist Donaldson, where I was for a long time, there are people there that have a fondness and a connection to a certain group of songs, and when you reach outside that group of songs, it doesn't feel like church to them. So it's very, very interesting. Any questions or comments on anything we talked about tonight before we move into the Eucharist?
Well, kind of what you just talked about, just the 3 songs we sang out of this book. I couldn't tell you what we sang at all.
Yeah. And those are old. Obviously, I picked really old songs.
I was so about doing it the way it was supposed to be done. I had no idea what I was saying.
Isn't that funny? And see, and then there are people that feel the same way about some of the modern worship songs that we sing. That it just doesn't compute.
Yeah.
We did, what was that one we did today in church? The old,
How great thou art.
How Great Thou Art.
Yeah.
Yeah. We did some new stuff, and then we did that was sort of added in there and done some stuff with, but it was comfortable for me, and nice.
Yeah,
I mean, I wouldn't want to do it every day. Every Sunday is
throwing in
boring, but
something old.
it was not. I like the
That's
mix.
what I was going to say. I like
the
when we
mix
kind of
up.
when things are either updated, like Amazing Grace, and
Updated, yeah.
or things are mixed.
Well, and a lot of that has to do too with for me, with the text. Like I want the words. The music may feel antiquated and may not fit quite right, so I might adapt the music somewhat or mash it up with something that works. Like there's a song we do, "Draw Me Nearer," and that it has a bridge. I took the bridge out and I replaced it with "Nearer, nearer, blessed Lord, to the cross where Thou hast died," because I love that chorus. But that's not a hymn that we would necessarily do like in total.
The whole hymn. Yeah.
But to take a little bit of it and stick it in there was, I like that. Anything else?
You said that the music wasn't forefront, I guess, in the early church.
Not in the beginning, not that we can tell.
At least not recorded. So what is your personal viewpoint on where music is? Or should be in the church? Are we giving it too much, too less?
Some churches give it way too much. But again, I think it just depends on, some churches are very teaching centric, right? They have a strong personality behind the pulpit maybe, and so Sunday becomes a lot more about that. Sometimes a church has a lot of lights and smoke machines, and they have a great band, and they have a charismatic leader, and so music is a big part of what they do.
And it's Nashville.
And it's Nashville, right?
Where you have an abundance of talent.
Right, where there's an abundance of talent. I think that what we do, and when I say we, I mean worship arts team, what we do here needs to be reflective of who's there, but it also needs to challenge. So it's not enough for me to just poll the congregation and find out who everybody, what everybody's favorite songs are, and we do those every week. I also have to kind of pull you somewhere. I think that a lot of us grew up with those of us that grew up in the church, we grew up with the same short list of songs, and the words lose all meaning after a while. And so I think it's important, one, to keep introducing new things, because it takes truth and spins it a different way. And sometimes we need truth to be spun around. I also think it's great to take those old words and do something new with them, package them differently. But the important thing is that what I do up here, what we do up here connects, because if it doesn't, then nobody's gonna. It was fun, maybe it was fun, or maybe it wasn't even fun. If there's not a real connection, then it's nothing more than fun. or nothing more than show, or nothing more than indulgent on my part. It could just be me doing my favorite song, you know, because I like to do it or whatever, you know what I mean? So there needs to be a point. And I think that worship, and we could do a whole nother series on just what worship is and why we worship, but worship is a very, very, very important part of what we do corporately together. I don't think it needs to be the part of what we do. It doesn't need to be the biggest part of what we do, but it is important. And I think it's very important that it be relevant to where we are. And I can tell you in 9 years, this has changed a whole lot. I don't approach worship the way that I did when I started. And I don't approach worship the way I did 5 years ago. So it's always changing. And I think part of my job is to be aware of what's happening, aware of how the Spirit's moving, and also how the congregation's responding. There are songs that we do, that I try, that we do a few times and we never do again. There are songs that we've done for years that no longer work, that we don't do anymore. That's why I'm always introducing new things, because this needs to stay fresh. This needs to stay new and exciting for all of us. And, you know, and there may come a time when I wake up and realize, hey, we need to be doing more ancient hymns. We need to be doing more, you know, and that may become a part of what we do. I mean, I sneak old songs in all the time, but that may become more a part of what we do. So,
one thing I noticed that was, and you can tell me if I'm thinking about this correctly, is like the classical period and the romantic, the shift, it was almost like classical was all about the challenge of making technically amazing music, almost mathematical. And then romantic, it was about conveying feelings, telling a story.
mm-hmm.
Because that's kind of, I always, when I hear it, that's how it feels. Like I can go, oh my God, that's technically amazing.
Yeah.
What they do, you know, but the other one's like, oh, you know, it's like, and I feel like that some of that is still, or is happening in the church as well. Like they're like what you're saying you were doing. So I feel like there are Sunday mornings where I really feel like the music has told me a story.
Mm-hmm.
You know, that, and it does usually, of course, relate to whatever the sermon is, and I really like that. You know, but there's just kind of a shift from, you can have technically perfect music with absolutely no feeling.
Right. Right.
You know, and that's kind of where, like you were saying, you were singing the words because you could
trying to
follow
get the
along,
melody.
you know.
Right.
And, you know, and I can barely follow along the notes myself, so I can do that, but it doesn't necessarily make me feel anything, you know.
Right.
Which is...
Yeah, I think that's a lot of what the revolt of the Romantic period was. I think, okay, we figured out how to do this now. It
Let's
feels
have
like to
fun with
me,
it.
yeah, it's like the first period of music where there is that real attention and emphasis given to the emotional impact of a piece. Up until then, I think there were pieces that were meant to achieve things. There were songs that achieved purposes. And they were beautiful in what they were, but they were very technically kind of rigid and kind of almost like an exercise. Here's what we're going to build now, and here's what we're going to build now, and we're going to see how these two things play together. And then all of a sudden, the 1800s trip over, and people are like, oh, we can do this now. But things are so beautiful, and life is so wonderful, and it's all so grand, and we need to sing about that, and we need to write about that. And so then art and music and everything becomes very pretty and very light and very, without the tedium of all that counterpoint and rules.